Okay, welcome back. So we didn't get a chance to finish this presentation during the lesson, what with the session confusion, and it's a lot to cover. So I'm going to finish it in this independent video. I'm going to go back and record the first half to make it cleaner. So here we go. We're talking about the second half of this lesson, which is complex carbohydrates. So on the guided notes, you should be looking at this page right here where it talks about plants making more than they can immediately need. So we've already talked about, we've introduced the concept of polysaccharides. I'm gonna actually, you know what, I'm gonna start here. So we've already shown you these illustrations of a monodi and polysaccharide, and this is where I'm gonna pick up. We covered it already, but this is where complex carbohydrates start in notes, so that's where I'm gonna go. Okay. Just a recap, we are looking at the big idea that we discussed in class about specific evidence for these three elements, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and other specific elements to form the four organic molecules. We've got three targets: understanding characteristics of organic compounds, recognize organic compounds contain carbon, and carbon atoms are the building blocks for essential molecules, and then recognize that trace elements are found within some organic compounds. Trace elements being like phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen. Okay, so we saw this picture already. Why isn't this showing up? Oh, here we go. We saw this picture already. Mono means one, di means two, sugar molecules linked together. Poly means many. Polygon has many sides, right? Polysaccharide has many sugars. So now we're talking about complex carbohydrates, the ones that are large instead of just the one little geometric shape. Polysaccharides, at this point in the notes, you should just be writing down that you need many simple sugar molecules linked together to make a polysaccharide. So in the notes, you just have to fill in this part that's red. I've provided you with all the illustrations that I've provided in the presentation on your guided notes. So you don't have to be an artist. You just have to follow along. So plants make more than they immediately need. So where does it go? Plants go through photosynthesis. They bring in energy from the sun. They take in carbon dioxide, which has carbon and oxygen. They take in water from their roots and the rain, which is hydrogen and oxygen, and it builds that together to form a carbohydrate. In this case, it's stored as starch. Plants store extra carbohydrates as starch, which is lots of glucoses linked together. When we eat a plant, we're eating the starch that it's stored up. Like if you eat a potato, that's a big bunch of starch. There is a non-digestible complex in plants that is also made of starch, and that's called cellulose. If you're writing your notes on a piece of paper, that's what the paper's made up of, is cell walls. It's found in plants as a means to support. When a plant needs to stay upright, for example, it needs a cell wall or a whole bunch of cell walls in order to do that. And so that cell wall is made of cellulose. Chitin is found in the exoskeleton of insects. What? Okay, so think about an ant, how it's got that armor around it to prevent it from, damaging itself while it's running around on the ground. It's like a skeleton, but on the inside, because insects don't have bones. So why do they make that pop when you squish them? That's the exoskeleton. That's that armor that gets cracked when too much pressure is applied. Sorry to be gross, but that's the idea. So here's how you see chitin in nature. You'll see it as exoskeletons of arthropods, which just means some bugs, anything with 8 legs, yeah? So some bugs, crabs, some insects, some lobster tails, which are totally yummy. Diatoms are microscopic. Some invertebrate animals that you see in the ocean that need structure, like starfish or anemones, shells that are, they call them mollusks, but basically oysters, for example. And then some cell walls of fungus, mushrooms, molds, and yeast. So chitin is everywhere in nature. Cellulose is what you don't get to digest when you chew paper, which I don't recommend you do. But branching structures of complex carbohydrates. So extra glucose, like we said, is stored. Because these structures are large, they can't just stack on themselves like sheets. So what ends up happening is they end up having a branched structure. So what do you need to know about that? Branching gives more points for digestion. What's going to happen is an enzyme, which we'll talk about later, but an enzyme is a special protein that breaks things down or builds them up. But in this case, it's going to run along this molecule and, oh, this is a good place for me to snip off that branch, and then another one will come along and snip off that branch, and then this branch and this branch, so that it breaks it down into better digestible pieces. The more branches there are, the easier it will be to break that part of the carbohydrate down and use it. Every time it's broken apart, a little bit of energy is released. So enzymes break down the structure and they release glucose for cellular respiration. Glucose, remember from earlier in our discussion, glucose results in ATP, which is the money we use in the cell to get things done. So I'm going to take a little minute just to hammer home the importance of enzymes. But when we talk about energy being stored in carbohydrates, they're being stored in the bonds between, I wish I had a better pointer, the bonds between the individual monosaccharides. So here, this glucose and this glucose, the energy that we use as cells isn't stored here. It's stored in this bond here, the oxygen to carbon bonds between these two monomers of carbohydrates. So what ends up happening, I just put this blue disc here so you could picture it sliding along, and as it comes to these bonds, it's going to break them, right? And so each of these glucose are free to go and be used to make ATP. So you might recognize this. Some of you with a medical issue may have lactose intolerance. Well, lactose is it's a disaccharide, but the lactose enzyme that breaks down lactose into something you can use, not everybody has a functioning version of that. So if you can't eat dairy and it makes your tummy hurt, that's because for some reason or other, the enzyme that your body needs to break that apart, you either don't have or it's not working correctly. So you're lactose intolerant. So it's the lactase enzyme that isn't working for you. So there are enzyme builders that will link them together, and there are enzyme breakers that will break them off in pieces so the body can use them to make ATP. There are two types, just to reiterate. There is starch and there are cellulose. Starches is a stored glucose. It's the branched chains that plants store. So think of it like a big potato. The cellulose structure is in plant cell walls, and it's used to support the plant's structure. It takes a lot longer to digest complex carbohydrates than it does simple sugar. And that's why you stay fuller longer when you eat oatmeal instead of a sugary cereal. So oatmeal is really complex. It has the starch in the kernel, and it also has the cellulose of the plant cell wall, which is what's holding the grain together. Polysaccharides, many sugars in plants. Again, starches and cellulose. Starches is for stored glucose. Cellulose is for structure. So starch is the branched chain. Are you picking up the pattern I'm saying here? Starch is the branched chain of glucose that plants store. So what you need to write down here is starch equals plants. Actually, I don't think you have to write anything down here. So on your notes, where it says importance of molecular structure, oh yeah, you have to write these two things down. Okay, so in your notes, where it asks you for the importance of molecular structure, which is where you should be if you're following along, we talked about, we introduced that to you up here, and then this is the part you have to fill out. Okay, which is on the page I'm on. We did this. There's no notes here. That's what I'm looking at. There's no notes here to fill out. Okay, two types on plants. Yeah, There's not part of the notes to fill out, so go ahead and leave that part. There's nothing to fill out there. But you do have to fill it out in the next part here, which is where you'll see me in this slide. So, go away. Okay, so for this part, what you need to know about cellulose and write down is that it's hard to break down for food. You don't have the stomach for it. And it's great for structure. Starch is easy to break apart for energy. Okay, so starch versus cellulose down here. They look the same, but look at how the little flags are hanging off opposite ends of the cellulose. Okay, you're not going to be great. You're not going to be assessed on that on the test. You just have to know this part for the test. I'm just hoping that some of you being visual learners will find it better that way. So why is it shaped that way? Well, look at the background of this picture. It's shaped that way so that they can use it for building blocks for structure. You as an animal stores glucose as well. Okay? We just call it something else. We call it glycogen. So for your notes here, I've given you 2 bullets, right? But it's just one. I just wanted to give you enough space. So it's really just the 2 bullets that you see. And plants are the only ones to store glucose. We do it too. We just call it another name. We call it glycogen. And glycogen is the branched chain of glucose that animals store. It's complicated, but we store it in the muscle. So let's say you got to run to get the mail. The first energy you're going to use comes from the sugar that you store in your muscles. And then after that, it's going to come from your fat, your body fat, which this guy doesn't have any. But that's the first energy that's used is your muscle sugars. You store them in the muscle. And then after that, you're going to go to fats to break them down. All right, so here's those lesson targets. That's all I have for complex. Make sure you have a good understanding of them. I will see you tomorrow.